Hello, so I'm sitting here with Jeff Darton to talk to you about early hints. So, Jeff, I'll leave it to you. What do you want to share with the world about early hints, or how do you want to frame this?
Yeah, I've been getting asked a lot recently, what exactly are early hints? And early hints are a way for a web page to tell a browser what are the kinds of resources that are going to need to be loaded ahead of the time that the browser actually knows about them in order to improve what we would say is the perceived render of a web page, what the end user feels how quickly the web page is going to load. And those are done in a very specific way, and we can kind of talk about how you would implement those. But bottom line is, it's a way to tell the browser what resources are going to be loaded later on the page before the browser actually knows that it needs to have them.
So, who should care about this? Like, what are the benefits here?
Yeah, so early hints are specifically focused on improving those render metrics, and there's kind of two reasons why render metrics are important. One, it obviously makes the page feel faster for the user, and so when they can interact with the page, they're going to be more likely to follow through on whatever that transaction is. So when we're talking about retail, that's going to be adding to the cart or browsing more pages or clicking on a recommended item. But it may be whatever the journey is that you're looking at. If it's a bank, maybe it's logging into your account or whatever. But the faster the page performance, the more interaction you're going to get from the end user. But the second part is really around SEO, and we're talking about core web vitals here, which is the metrics that Google is saying affects how they rank your site for performance and how that affects your search rankings. So specifically within core web vitals, it's the largest contentful paint, LCP, and you'll hear that thrown around a lot. That's representing how much time it takes from when I start to load the page to when the largest contentful object shows up on that page. Generally, that's going to be something like a hero image or the product image or whatever kind of the main focus of that page is. And it times how long it takes for that to show up. Again, we want that to show up sooner rather than later. But that's also used in your search rankings. So now we're actually talking about the SEO team cares about this as well. So everybody kind of cares about improving performance, but it really comes down to measuring those specific metrics, and early hints targets largest contentful paint and improves that for your end users as well as for your SEO.
Awesome. I've heard the term early hints been thrown down in a few contexts. Some are kind of these early image hints that often have to do with contentful paint. What other types of early hints are there?
Yeah, so the reason for early hints is just inherently, if you think about the way the browser works, it's not super efficient. I'm going to request a web page, and so I go out and I access that page or request that page to come back from the server. And that comes back with some headers that'll be in the TCP request that'll say some certain things about the request, and then it'll contain the request body, which is generally going to be the HTML page. The browser then has to wait for that whole page to come down and then load all that content up and start to parse through that HTML and say, oh, I need this JavaScript, I need this CSS, I need this image, I need to connect to this domain in order to get this font. And it has to go through all of that sequentially, and that takes time. So there's certain things that we can do with those headers that kind of was where we started with performance improvements, was in those headers, and I'll talk about that in a second. But then we can also think about those resources down below. So there's two kind of synchronous waits that are happening there. We talked about the first one, which is me making the request out to the website itself and waiting for that response to get back. Think about if that's a search page, and maybe I've got to run a very expensive search query and I'm returning 300 or 400 items on a page. That's going to take time in order for the origin to think about that in order to render that content. And while that's happening, I'm staring at a blank screen as the end user. And so specifically what early hints are is when we go and request that, the server responds immediately with a 103 early hint, which has some specific directives in it. And as you mentioned, it might say, go load this image, or go connect to this domain because I know you're going to need this font later on. And so that early hint allows the browser to warm up connections or go reach and access certain resources. So those are preload, which is go connect to something and actually get the resource, or pre-connect, which is just go connect to that domain and wait for further instructions. But all of that is happening during the time that the origin is thinking and responding with that request. So we've optimized that time window instead of starting that clock after we receive all the information. So early hints, preload and pre-connect, two different kinds, but the type of content does matter. Mostly we talk about images because we're focusing on largest contentful paint, and generally that's an image. So we're going to say, hey, this is going to be your largest contentful paint. Go get it right now and get it displayed as soon as you can in order to make that page load quickly. But pretty much it can be any cacheable resource. So it could be a CSS file or a JavaScript file or a font file. And all of those things are essential in how the page renders. So I want to have access to those things that are going to accelerate the rendering of the page and not make the browser wait at any point in time. And again, there's some certain things that you want to think about, which what types of cacheable assets to do. But in general, you're going to look at your page and say, what are the things that block my rendering? How can I preload or pre-connect on those in order to take the most advantage of that early think time and get that perceived render to be as fast as possible?
So if I'm understanding this correctly, there's within a website, rather than just getting the information to load everything all at once, thus going through the instructions like, oh, I need to get this, oh, I need to get this, oh, I need to get that as we're going down. You're just sending all the instructions first. Let's warm up those connections, as you said, so we have everything ready.
Right, yeah, and we've gone through a couple renditions of this, so a little bit of history here, right? So this kind of started with the advent of HTTP 2, which is a protocol for communicating between web browsers and web servers. And HTTP 2 introduced this concept of server push. And the idea with server push is it allowed the server, as soon as it received the request for a web page, to start pushing resources down. CSS files, JavaScript files, font files, etc. And so that was perceived as the fastest way we could do it. I'm not even going to wait to tell you what to get. I'm just going to give it to you, right? And that sounded really good, but we found out that that actually was more detrimental to performance because we were sending resources to you that you maybe didn't need. You maybe already had them in your device cache or something like that. So it really didn't work out the way that folks hoped, but it started the concept of there's a way for us to signal more quickly to a browser about what it's going to need to do rather than wait for it to get all those instructions. So that evolved then, we talked about headers, that evolved into pre-connect and preload headers, which basically are very similar to early hints in that when that response comes back, the first thing that loads is the headers, and there may be a pre-connect or a preload directive in there. Go connect to this domain or go load this resource. That's great, but we still had to wait for the first response to come back from the origin. So we're still not taking advantage of that origin think time. We still have to get that whole page, and on the first bite of the response, we start to be able to do something. So early hints goes one step beyond that and is now saying we're going to optimize for it. And instead of saying everything on that page, it's those most critical resources. What are the things that are going to be this plus this plus this is going to make the page render faster, and everything that's further down below the fold, well, we can load that later, but we're going to prime the pump as much as we can with those critical resources early on.
So how do we go about identifying what those critical resources are? Because it sounds like there could be a lot of different options here.
Yeah, and this is where the challenge comes in, is that anybody can do early hints, but to be able to do early hints effectively and to be able to maintain and manage that as your site changes all the time and the layout changes and the content changes can become very challenging. The great part about it is, what's the largest contentful paint object? Your browser will tell you, right? Like, this is part of the API that it identifies that, and we can say this was the object that I timed and that was determined to be most contentful. So if you just wanted to push the largest contentful paint item, hint the largest contentful paint item, you could do that. Or you could maintain and manage those. As well as there's a lot of real user monitoring tools out there that can help advise which objects are render blocking and all of those different components that come together. So you have to build that list either kind of manually by understanding your site, or delegate that to a content developer that may understand how they put that page together and add those early hints to a database that could be referenced. Or again, work with a vendor that may have some sort of smart detection to decide what the early hints are going to be based on some sort of real user patterns one way or the other. But somewhere there's got to be a database that says, on this page, these are the hints that I want to send when the request comes in.
Awesome. So like bringing this over to the Harperverse, or like Harper, how do we do this at Harper, and Why is early hints so important with what we're doing?
Yeah. Uh, well, we talked about just now, right? It's
Yeah,
got to be
yeah,
stored in
well,
a database, and inherently Harper is a database, but it's more than that, right? And so instead of just having a database, we also provide the layer for the API interaction and the application to go fetch and return those early hints. One thing about early hints is not every origin supports them. So whatever the web server is or third-party content provider, they may or may not actually support this 103 early hints response. Sometimes have to layer in a proxy, whether that's a CDN or an application layer like Harper, to be able to provide that intelligence and then the ability to respond with that. So one, we provide not only the storage of where those early hints are, but the logic to look them up and the ability to respond with that 103 response. In addition, we're able to do that in a very performant manner because the application and the data layer are residing on that single node. And generally, those nodes are distributed worldwide or wherever the user base is of our customers. And so the end user response is extremely fast as well. So we end up being the target of that database. The customer will push all the information into us and say, here's on this page, I want you to hint these resources. And when that request comes in, we immediately look that up and respond with the 103 response, and then wait for the origin to return that page and send all of that content forward. And then we could do interesting things like cache that page or do a variety of other things at that point in time. But in the very basic component, it's look up the early hint and respond with that 103 response closer to the end user and in a faster way than going all the way back to origin. Because remember, we're trying to avoid that origin think time. So if we still have to go all the way there, it doesn't really make sense for the 103 response to be there. So pushing that closer to the end user makes the most sense.
I see. So with people looking for early hint solutions today, like what should they be thinking about? What should they be exploring? What do they need to know before diving in with a solution?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing whenever you're looking at a performance improvement is to understand what am I trying to improve. And so we kind of have to measure what is first. So if you're setting out to improve your LCP, great, then early hints should be part of the conversation. There's lots of other things that you can do and should do to help improve LCP. This is just one of the tools in the toolbox. But make sure we understand we have a baseline first. What is my LCP now? What's my target? And generally, how much am I willing to spend, right? You can spend a lot of money on a performance improvement that doesn't have the return. So you'll hear the term performance budget be tossed around, and generally that's how much can we spend in order to get to a certain performance level, and those are targets that we want to hit. So understand what is, how much we're willing to spend, how much we're willing to invest, and am I an expert at doing that? One, identifying those resources to push, and do I have the capability in my tech stack to do so? And if you answer no to either of those, then reaching out to a partner like Harper to be able to help you navigate that and bring in some expertise and bring in the technology to be able to deliver that is a good thing to do early on in the process and say, here's what we're thinking about, rather than I'm trying to do this and we're way down the road and now we're having problems.
That makes a lot of sense. So I feel like that's all that we need for today. Is there anything else that you'd like to leave everyone with, or any additional thoughts?
Yeah, I think the only thing that I would say is that we early hints is really looking at the nuts and bolts, and just don't lose sight of what you're trying to accomplish. Right, we're improving LCP, but again, that's still just a technological goal. The reason why we improve LCP is to improve the performance of the page. That's to make it so that you get more eyeballs to your page based on SEO improvements, or you get more conversions on that page based on the performance. So this is all around achieving business outcomes rather than just technology for technology's sake.
So at the end of the day, it's really about revenue that's driving
That's
this.
right. This is not a cost savings measure. This is a revenue generating step that you can take. Absolutely.
Awesome. Well, I hope everyone out there gets that point, and it's really exciting to see what we're doing here at Harper, and I'm excited to have you on board, Jeff.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Alex. Good talking with you.